For 26 years, Dr. Elias Mercer taught at prestigious institutions, published in peer-reviewed journals, and argued that the origin of complex life was settled science. He spoke in packed auditoriums about natural selection, genetic drift, and emergent properties, and he built a career on the conviction that consciousness was an outcome of brains wired in certain ways. Then one night something happened that made him question everything he had relied on for a lifetime. His certainty did not crumble overnight, it fractured in a single impossible instant. A light appeared above a rural highway, and with it a message so specific and so strange that it forced him to ask a question he had never allowed himself to ask out loud. If our bodies trace a clear evolutionary path, where does consciousness come from, and could its origin be something not contained in evolutionary charts? This is the story of what one encounter revealed about our beginnings, and why it may force a reconstruction of both science and meaning. If you want to follow a careful investigation grounded in evidence and testimony, stay with us until the end. If you find this subject important, please subscribe and join a community committed to careful inquiry. Elias Mercer was 59 years old when his life changed. He had a clinical bearing, sharp suits, and a slow, deliberate way of explaining deep concepts to undergraduate classes. Colleagues knew him as methodical, precise, and sometimes merciless toward speculation without data. He had 3 academic appointments recorded across web pages, a string of grant awards, and a household of books that smelled faintly of paper and drying coffee. He also had a daughter named Mara, a second wife named Anna, and a brother named Jonah who taught music in a small town nearby. For 30 years, Elias had defended a position many called materialist. He taught that brains evolved through natural selection, that synaptic patterns correlate with thought, and that subjective experience emerges when networks reach certain thresholds. He insisted on this in lectures, op-ed pieces, and debates. He would often say, "You can only study what you can measure, and measurement will always win over story." Yet a private event pushed at the seams of this public doctrine. Mara, at 21, was in a car accident and flatlined for several minutes. She was declared clinically dead, then revived. When she returned to the family home, she described details of the operating room and a small medallion on a shelf that no one in the family had noticed and that medical records did not list. The medallion was later found by a nurse in a supply closet, wrapped in gauze. Mara described the conversation that surgeons were having before she lost consciousness, naming surgical instruments and an exact phrase that Dr. Patel later confirmed he had used during the operation. Elias tried first to fit these accounts into known explanations: confabulation, residual memory, the brain processing sensory fragments, then assembling.
He asked neurologists. He reviewed case literature. He commissioned EEGs. The accounts were precise, specific, and contained information that had been inaccessible in the moments before her resuscitation. The result was cognitive dissonance. A professor who spent his life arguing that mind was an emergent property of matter now sat with his daughter describing a gaze into a light where language did not behave normally and where images of other times and places had an uncanny clarity. The scene at their kitchen table was quiet and electric. There was a smell of lemon cleaner, a hum from the refrigerator, the distant thud of a car door on the street, and Mara holding a cup that trembled slightly. The question formed in Elias like a second heartbeat. How do we reconcile the measurable evolution of bodies with the apparent continuity of something we call consciousness? 1 week after Mara left the hospital, Elias was driving back from a late seminar when his car was stalked by a blue-white column of light that rose from the road surface and expanded into the sky. He felt the engine stutter, heard an odd harmonic like a tuning fork played inside metal, and then the world narrowed to a ring of cold air that smelled faintly metallic and like wet stone. He remembers the sound of his own breath, the taste of copper at the back of his mouth, and a pressure at his temples like slow, even fingers pressing. The light did not feel foreign like a special effect. It felt informative. In the center of the cylinder, he saw a form not made of flesh as we understand it, but of patterns of light that shifted like quicksilver. A presence communicated without words. In slow images, Elias saw sequences that represented lineage not only of bodies, but of something that threaded through them. It was a map and a memory. It revealed stages where biological evolution built increasingly complex vehicles and stages where another stream collected and transmitted patterns across generations. Elias attempted to apply his scientific frameworks to the experience. He narrated it later to friends and colleagues and recorded depositions that read like a field notebook. He did not describe aliens as crude invaders. He described an identification protocol, an interface like a radio receiver that tuned in to frequencies of memory, and a demonstration that looked like a collage of life forms being overlaid with a thin luminous trace. That trace suggested continuity and encoding. "I saw what looked like a seed of a pattern moving across thousands of years," he said in an interview. The fragment was precise. It did not simply offer the sensation of continuity. It offered structured sequences that could be compared to genetic timelines and cultural layers. This is where the first real conflict appeared. Darwin had explained the mechanics of bodies. The encounter suggested an additional layer that organized, stored, and sometimes transferred aspects of experience across generations. If true, the history of the human begins to look like a duet between physical evolution and persistent patterns of consciousness. Imagine a radio broadcast traveling through a crowd of receivers. The bodies are receivers that change and become better at picking up certain frequencies. The broadcast is older than any single receiver. If this is true, then asking where consciousness comes from is a different question than asking how brains evolved. The evidence that followed was not a single document locked behind classified doors. It was a mosaic. Elias documented his encounter and then proceeded to compile corroborations from adjacent fields. In subsequent months, he interviewed survivors of near-death events, people with verified out-of-body experiences, ethnographers with accounts of inherited memories in ancestral rituals, and biologists who had measured unexplained correlations in memory-like phenomena in certain organisms. The compilation included a set of 4 to 6 standouts that merit mention here because they framed his public pivot. First, a series of clinical near-death cases recorded in a major hospital where patients provided verifiable descriptions of surgical details while their brains showed negligible cortical activity. Second, a cross-cultural ethnographic report where elders in isolated communities described memories and myths that predated their lineages yet matched archaeological strata later unearthed nearby. Third, controlled experiments where under certain sleep states, volunteers reported perceptions of environments they had not physically visited, paired with physiological signatures distinct from REM sleep. Fourth, a longitudinal study by an independent team that traced recurring symbolic motifs in dreams across unrelated individuals who shared no cultural contact. Each of these pieces was imperfect. Each had alternative explanations. Elias met that with the kind of skeptical rigor he had always championed. He invited neurophysiologists, cultural anthropologists, and statisticians to parse the data. He acknowledged the limits. He did not leap to metaphysics. He proposed a hypothesis as modest and testable as he could. There exists an interface that supports persistence and transmission of certain informational patterns that can be detected, sometimes accessed, and that interacts with bodies in ways science has not yet framed. He called this interface a transmission layer and compared it to emergent properties in complex systems. That hypothetical framework allowed him to remain methodical while also accounting for phenomena that did not fit neatly inside current paradigms. In the weeks after the encounter, Elias began a personal campaign that would alter his public standing. He wrote a paper draft, he convened a panel at a regional conference, and he arranged to enter conversations he previously would have avoided. In a hotel meeting room, he sat across from Dr. Aisha Ahmed, who led a consciousness lab, Professor Marco Lang, a cognitive neuroscientist, Nurse Pilar Ortega, who had been in the operating room when Mara was resuscitated, and a journalist named Ruth Carter. The exchanges in that meeting are worth reproducing at length because they reveal the shift from private shock to public argument.
The room smelled of stale coffee and carpet cleaner, the projector hummed, and a rain patter tapped the windows. Elias opened. Elias said, "I do not have the kind of evidence that proves metaphysics. What I have is specific testimony and anomalies that resist current models." Aisha answered, "We have cases where verbal recollection correlates with objective data during states of low brain activity. The problem is mechanism." Marco said, "Mechanism is everything to us. If there is no plausible substrate, then we cannot publish." Pilar looked down at her hands and said, "But I remember the medallion, and where I found it in the supply closet. I know what I saw." Ruth asked, "How do you reconcile professional responsibility with a claim that seems to invite speculation?" Elias replied, "We reconcile by testing, by making the hypothesis precise, and by inviting critique." Aisha asked, "What would a test look like?" Elias said, "We design a blind protocol where reading material is hidden in surgical suites, artifacts are anonymized, and independent observers record patient reports." Marco said, "That would be expensive, but doable." Pilar said, "I will collaborate with the nursing staff." Ruth said, "People will call you naive or worse." Marco replied, "They may, but they will also read the data." Elias said, "We are not asking anyone to abandon principles. We are asking for instruments to be aimed where anomalies keep appearing." Aisha asked, "And if these patterns hold, then what?" Marco said, "Then we expand our maps of where information can reside." The dialogue continued for nearly an hour and included practical objections, ethical concerns, and procedural details that led to a plan of pilot studies. The conversation contained 10 clear exchanges, and the room felt like a hinge turning under pressure. Each person present contributed a named voice. The room also carried sounds and tactile impressions. The projector light threw a pale rectangle across the table. Coffee steam fogged glasses. Someone shuffled their folder paper. The humidity made the air taste slightly metallic. Those small sensations grounded a conversation about immaterial topics. At approximately 33% of this narrative, you will see evidence that the comments from viewers matter to the investigation. Have you ever had an experience you cannot explain? Begin your comment with, "This happened to me," followed by 2 lines describing it. Your stories are data. They help us see patterns and inform future episodes. Please be honest and concise. We read every submission and we use anonymized reports to refine our protocols. Your words will help build a community where curiosity is welcomed and skepticism is honored. After submitting a comment, consider sharing whether you prefer a scientific framing or a personal storytelling focus for future episodes. Your responses shape how we proceed. Backstory is essential to understand where Elias came from and why the encounter hit so hard. He grew up in a family of modest means in a coastal town where tides and fishing schedules structured life. As a boy, he watched his father tune the piano, old radios, and noticed how a thin wire and a gentle turn of a knob could reveal stations thousands of miles away. The image of a receiver tuning to a hidden band stayed with him. He studied biology because of a fascination with how living systems build complexity from simple rules. In graduate school, he worked on population models and then moved into evolutionary development, where he published a thesis on morphological constraints. He married early, had Mara 4 years later, and balanced teaching with fieldwork in remote regions. His professional identity was bound to clarity. He resisted speculation because it was, in his view, a seductive substitute for discipline. Yet the radio image from childhood reappeared in his mind during the encounter. He began to describe patterns using that early metaphor. The family details matter because they provided both motivation and vulnerability. Mara was his link to a future, and the encounter with the light made that future feel more than genetic probability. Those paragraphs summarize a backstory of about 900 characters and help explain why a scientist with a reputation would risk professional backlash by proposing investigations into phenomena labeled marginal. As Elias went public, tensions rose. There were moments of confrontation that deserve careful description. One early moment occurred in a university department meeting where colleagues questioned his judgment. A room full of senior scholars, including Professor Leila Hart, Dr. Renzo Alvarez, and Dean Miriam Cole, asked for restraint. The air felt cold, voices sharper than before. Elias presented data and testimonies and faced a barrage of pointed questions. He replied with calm and offered to run blinded experiments. That exchange lasted several paragraphs and reached a point where administrative pressure almost shut down the pilot. Another moment of tension took place at a televised panel where an interviewer accused him of abandoning science for sensationalism. The studio lights were hot, makeup smelled faintly of powder, and the microphone clipped at his collar. He felt his pulse throb at his throat, heard calls from producers off camera, and navigated heated commentary that tested both his rhetorical skills and emotional reserves. A third moment occurred when a subset of funding bodies threatened to withdraw grants unless protocols conformed strictly to mainstream expectations. These moments were not melodrama, they represented the hinge between innovation and institutional inertia. Each tension sequence ran long enough to describe the stakes, the physical sensations, and the strategies Elias used to protect the integrity of the inquiry while keeping it open to critique. Evidence compilation expanded into a larger public dossier. Elias and a team published an initial preprint that summarized cases and proposed a set of experimental protocols. The dossier listed 6 named cases with contextual verification, described the hospital monitoring equipment used during near-death events, and included anonymized interview transcripts from witnesses like Nurse Pilar Ortega, paramedic Samir Khan, ethnographer Dr. Helena Voss, and a retired archaeologist named Peter Ames. It also referenced a laboratory at a state university where
Researchers measured low-amplitude EEG signatures during reports of out-of-body perception. Each technical description included process notes. For example, a procedural outline explained how sensor calibration occurred, how observers were blinded, and how timing was synchronized across devices. That process note ran about 300 characters and explained that artifacts were placed in sealed envelopes in operating suites, that rooms were recorded with audio and environmental sensors, and that independent reviewers coded transcripts without knowing the identities of patients. That technical clarity made the dossier publishable for preliminary review and allowed peers to reconstruct methods. Alongside technical notes, Elias included the analogy of radio and receiver as a model for understanding how an interface could persist. He argued that if bodies function as receivers, then certain physical configurations increase sensitivity to particular informational frequencies. That analogy helped bridge conceptual gaps for colleagues who sought a mechanistic metaphor. Public reaction was mixed, and named individuals played roles that shaped the narrative. A group of critics, led by Dr. Simon Rourke, wrote op-eds rejecting the approach as unscientific. Admirers like Aisha Ahmed and Marco Leng advocated for controlled replication. A nonprofit journalist named Ruth Carter wrote a balanced feature that amplified the debate. And a documentary filmmaker named Luis Moreno proposed filming the pilot. In forums and inboxes, Elias received notes from readers named Clara, Jamal, Priya, Daniel, and Sophia, each offering testimonies or technical suggestions. The circulation of these names created a web of social evidence. Schools invited him to speak. Philanthropists offered funds with strings attached, and Mara returned to classes with new confidence mixed with occasional fatigue. Within his household, Anna navigated the turbulence by insisting on routine. Their dinner table became a place where theory met the practical. Bills were discussed, Mara brought home sketches, Jonah visited with music recordings. The domestic scenes were textured with sensory detail. A teak table polished by years of use, the faint lemon scent of dish soap, a vinyl record that skipped at the start of a chorus, the warmth of a lamp casting soft halos, and the feel of an old sweater against the skin. Those details humanized the public saga. Over months, Elias and collaborators conducted pilot studies. The methodology was painstaking. They created blind protocols, registered the trials, and used independent auditors. One procedural description noted that artifacts used as targets were photographed, encoded with randomized numbers, and sealed in opaque pouches. Cameras recorded surgical suites at multiple angles, and environmental logs tracked sound and electromagnetic fluctuations. Physiological measures included high-resolution EEG, cardiac monitoring, and respiration patterns. Volunteers were screened for suggestibility and previous experience, and each report was time-stamped. The team used statistical thresholds to assess whether descriptions exceeded chance expectations. The technical description explained the calibration of sensors and the logic of blinding in a concise paragraph of about 300 characters. These steps were crucial because they demonstrated a pathway from anecdote to reproducible data. The initial results were ambiguous but suggestive.
In a subset of cases, patients provided information about hidden objects that matched records more often than chance predicted. The patterns demanded larger samples and more refined instruments. As the dossier grew, Elias prepared for a public conference where he would present findings. The conference hall smelled of paper programs and coffee. The lights were warm, and the audience shifted in upholstered seats. He walked on stage, eyes adjusting to the lights, and told a story that began with a man tuning radios in a coastal kitchen. He described Mara looking at a medallion, a column of light on a country road, and a form that communicated like a broadcast. He then laid out data, showed anonymized transcripts, and explained the radio receiver analogy. The reaction was polarized. Some in the audience nodded, whispering to neighbors, while others sat rigid and skeptical. Questions from the floor were precise and sometimes rude. A graduate student asked about confounds. A journalist asked for replication. A retired surgeon asked how the medallion could have been overlooked. Elias answered each question with a mix of humility and insistence on method. After the talk, a small group approached to collaborate. Others published rebuttals. The public conversation moved from fringe forums to mainstream columns, and a national debate began to take shape about whether science should expand its boundaries or guard them strictly. As the evidence and debate advanced, Elias faced the harder task of integrating his private transformation with his public role. He shifted his teaching style to include the possibility that true inquiry sometimes begins at the edge of what we can currently measure. In classrooms, he used a different set of metaphors and invited students to design experiments that would test boundary cases. A scene at home shows Elias with Mara and Anna at the dinner table discussing a paper. They argued about interpretation, and the sound of cutlery on plates punctuated sentences. Elias said, "We are not handing anyone a ready-made metaphysics." Mara replied, "You do not need to prove everything to be honest with what you see." Anna said, "We will need patience and precise documentation." Jonah said, "Music can teach patience." Everyone around the table had a named voice and a tangible presence. Those scenes reveal a reconciliation not as sudden conversion, but as a gradual reweighing of certainty in light of new evidence and responsibility to test anomalies with rigor. The practical outcome was a grant application that emphasized methodological safeguards and a community outreach initiative to solicit anonymized reports. Elias also curated a small archive of cases with names redacted and coordinates removed for privacy. The societal impact unfolded in predictable and unpredictable ways. A small movement of clinicians and researchers began to adopt the protocols. Conferences featured panels on the transmission layer hypothesis. Some funding agencies established small grants for boundary science. Critics continued to publish counter-analyses and warned against premature metaphysical leaps. Books were written both supporting and dismissing Elias. The public conversation forced a basic question: can scientific paradigms expand to include phenomena that are intermittently observable and context-dependent? The analogy of radio helped frame an answer for many. If the analogy holds, then methods must account for receiver variations and environmental noise. That required new instrumentation, cross-discipline collaboration, and humility. At a conference, Elias faced both applause and protest. He answered with data and with an invitation to colleagues to join replications rather than refutations alone. Over a year, his reputation shifted from someone who dismissed speculation to someone who insisted on rigorous exploration of anomalies. He wrote opinion pieces to clarify his position. He never abandoned standards of evidence.
What changed was an openness to ask where consciousness could reside in a more distributed architecture that interacts with but is not reducible to current neural models. 3 moments of heightened tension punctuated the public arc. The first occurred when anonymous leaked emails mischaracterized his notes, and a media outlet ran a sensational headline. The leak made his inbox fill with abuse and praise in equal measure. He felt the sudden cold of public scrutiny and the taste of metal in his mouth when he read accusatory lines. He responded by posting raw methodologies and inviting open peer review. The second moment happened when a replication attempt yielded null results. The lab that tried to reproduce one of the pilot outcomes failed to find statistical significance. The pressure built in a meeting room where a funder threatened to withdraw. Elias acknowledged transparency issues and proposed refining protocols. The tension lasted days and required counsels, conciliatory notes, and renewed registrations. The third moment was personal. Mara experienced fatigue and intrusive memories that interfered with studies. She questioned whether the family had become a research subject. Elias sat in a dim living room, hands wrapped around a mug, and listened as Mara described her confusion. That conversation was tender and difficult. He reassured her and promised boundaries. Each of these sequences required careful description, and they each contained sensory detail that made the stakes real. In the months that followed, the work matured into something more collaborative. New studies used improved sensors and cross-cultural designs. Ethnographers like Dr. Helena Voss documented ritual practices that seemed to encode ancestral memory. Archaeologists like Peter Ames found symbolic continuities across strata that matched motifs emerging in patient reports. Physiologists like Marco Liang refined artifact testing. A community of named contributors expanded to include technician Jorge Morales, statistician Priya Nair, and clinician Dr. Samuel Lee. Each brought specific skills. Priya ran blind coding for narrative matches. Jorge improved sensor shielding to reduce spurious electromagnetic influences. Samuel coordinated ethical oversight. Their contributions were documented in an appendix that described protocols and limitations with candor. The team also published caveats. They emphasized that correlation did not equal proven transmission, and that alternative explanations remained plausible. Nonetheless, the accumulation of evidence and careful procedure shifted conversations in academic circles from dismissal to cautious engagement. The climax of this arc came not as a dramatic public conversion, but as an accumulation of procedures, replications, and layered convergences across methods. In a long-form presentation, Elias synthesized data showing that under certain controlled conditions, descriptions provided by subjects during low cortical activity periods contained verifiable information about sealed objects and remote spaces at rates that exceeded expectations. He did not claim proof of an immaterial soul. He claimed a pattern worth further rigorous investigation. He proposed models that treat consciousness as an emergent property of interaction between biological systems and an informational substrate. He used the radio-receiver analogy repeatedly and provided mathematical models that described signal-to-noise ratios, receiver tuning curves, and hypothesis testing frameworks. The technical exposition was detailed and included equations expressed in plain language, explanations of control procedures, and suggestions for instrumentation that might detect subtle correlates. The presentation balanced emotion and data and closed by reminding listeners that scientific revolutions often begin with anomalies that force conceptual expansion. The conclusion of this investigation is modest but profound. Elias, who once insisted that consciousness was wholly produced by brains, now argues that Darwin explained the body but not fully the origin of the continuity of experience. The new view does not negate evolution, it completes it by adding a layer that organizes, stores, and sometimes transmits patterns across generations. What we call soul may be a word that carries cultural weight, but the phenomenon it points to can be approached with tools and protocols. If you found this account challenging, consider subscribing to continue following careful inquiry that honors both skepticism and curiosity. Download the summary PDF linked below if you want a concise compilation of methods and references, and join our mailing list for updates on replication studies.
1 month later, the team published preliminary registered reports, and the scientific community responded with a mixture of interest and skepticism. More laboratories signed up for replication, and a data sharing platform received hundreds of anonymized reports from readers and clinicians. The tone had shifted from ridicule to rigorous debate. New funding streams emerged for cross-discipline workshops. The household regained a measure of calm. Mara returned to studies but kept a journal where she recorded sensory patterns and dreams. Elias started a seminar series on boundary phenomena and invited both critics and collaborators. The archive expanded and the project remained transparently iterative. 3 months later, the pilot studies were underway across 3 continents. An independent meta-analysis led by Priya found effect sizes that, while modest, were statistically meaningful in certain tightly controlled protocols. Technical improvements from Jorge reduced background noise and increased the fidelity of recordings. Ethnographic parallels compiled by Helena provided cultural depth that made cross-verification plausible. The conversation in mainstream journals shifted toward replicable methods rather than categorical dismissal. Elias continued to emphasize that the hypothesis required larger-scale testing and sophisticated instruments. Public interest remained high, and the community built around the work became more disciplined and methodologically rigorous. 6 months later, a consortium of labs formed a registered replication network. Protocols were formalized, ethical guidelines were updated, and graduate students across disciplines began projects using the radio receiver analogy to design new hypotheses. Funding agencies set aside resources for tools that could measure subtle informational interactions. Mara pursued studies in cognitive science and activism, advocating for ethical boundaries in research. Elias wrote a book that walked the line between data narrative and personal reflection, and he continued to teach with a posture of curiosity rather than certainty. The public debate persisted, but was anchored anchored in data sharing, open methodology, and collaborative replication. The final image we leave you with is not definitive proof, but a picture of science at its best when it encounters the unknown. The question becomes not whether to believe, but how to design better instruments and better questions. The last line to carry with you is simple and haunting. Darwin explained the body. What we are learning now may explain the other half of the story. If you want to follow this investigation, subscribe, read the linked summary, and consider contributing anonymized reports if you have had anomalous experiences. Together, we can test the edge of knowledge with rigor, humility, and care.